Okay, everyone. Thank you very much for coming along this evening to the 5th Sandy Duncanson Social Justice Lecture. Just a few preliminary housekeeping things before we formally commence. The evacuation points, if anything goes wrong, if there's a fire drill or an emergency, out the back door over towards Churchill Avenue near the bus stop over there, you gather. If you come out through these front doors, down below Lazenby's around the fountain area is where people gather. If the fire alarms do go off or something else happens, don't move. I'll instruct you what we're going to do and when we're going to do it, and then we'll proceed to take you out of the building. The toilets are downstairs off to the right-hand side down the stairs, and if you could put your phones on silent, that would be much appreciated in that process. So welcome very much to the Sandy Duncanson 2016 Social Justice Lecture. As a reflection of this institution's recognition of the deep history and culture of this island, the University of Tasmania wishes to acknowledge the Moonanea people, the traditional owners and custodians of the land upon which this campus was built. Now, often at these functions we stop at this point, but there's more to it, and I think because it is a Sandy Duncanson Social Justice Lecture, I think he would have appreciated the full acknowledgement. We acknowledge the contemporary Tasmanian Aboriginal community who have survived invasion and dispossession and continue to maintain their identity, culture and Indigenous rights. We also recognise the value of continuing Aboriginal knowledge and cultural practice, which informs our understanding of history, culture, science and environment. The university's role in research and education and in supporting the development of the Tasmanian community. So welcome to this 5th lecture. It's quite amazing to actually be here at the 5th lecture from when we first started to come this far. And no pressure, David, I know that you're feeling some, given the lineup that has actually preceded you. Michael Kirby, Andrea DeButch, Gillian Triggs, Janet Holmes Accord and Governor Kate Warner. That's an impressive alumni of speakers to have, and it's fantastic to have the Australian of the Year here to effectively continue that line of speakers. It's a wonderful social justice legacy in Sandy's Lane, and one that his family and friends must be proud of. As the years pass, Iris and Luca over there will learn much more about the man, the advocate and the social justice campaign that their daddy Sandy was in that process. Notice on Facebook they're already discovering some aspects about their father, and I think they'll continue to learn much more about him over time. If we'd just created this annual lecture that attracted the likes of the speakers I've just mentioned and an audience like you, that may have been enough to have honoured Sandy and the contributions that he's made. But numerous social justice initiatives and efforts have been inspired by these speakers. Each year something happens in the law school as a result of someone coming along to this lecture, listening to the talker and then going on and doing something as a social justice project. We've changed our strategic plan, so one of the strategic missions of the law school now is about law reform and social justice. So it's a commitment that we have as an institution that's come through these lectures and these versaries. Your job, David, is to inspire people in this audience to do more of that type of thing tonight. So it's only a small... well, you're the Australian of the Year, so the bar does go higher. Okay. However, that extra special bit, which I think is really special about this particular process, comes from being able to raise enough funds to sponsor at least 2 social justice projects a year by UTAS students in perpetuity. And we are within reach of being able to fund 3 a year, which will be a fantastic achievement. Sandy's family and his friends in the Social Justice Committee, including Bev Jefferson and Natasha Chika, who's made so much to the contribution of this event, can't be here tonight, but we'd like to thank all of you for coming, being donors, soon to be donors hopefully, and bursary recipients, and hopefully for some of you in this audience, soon to be bursary recipients. Every year we ask the newest recipients to report briefly on their projects, and this year we have 2 Singaporeans who, with their teams, have and will be making important contributions to social justice in this state. And I think that's a magnificent achievement, that kind of international connection that's reaching out from this particular process and procedures. Steve, can you come and help? I'll keep talking. It's okay, Steve and I barrack for Geelong, and we're just, kind of post-trauma, trying to accomplish and do things here. So every year we ask the newest recipients to report briefly on their projects, and this year we've got 2 magnificent Singaporean students to do that. So this is a total of 7 students who've actually gone through this particular process with bursaries. So I'd just like to briefly, it says here again, okay, I'd just like to briefly thank all these recipients and their bursaries, and I'd like to ask George and Saras to come forward now just to speak briefly about their projects before we continue.
A very good evening to our distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. The Student Refugee Support Society, or SRS for short, was established last year and works in collaboration with the Migrant Resource Centre. SRS was founded with the goal of providing form support to refugees seeking migration outcomes in Australia through the government's special humanitarian program. This program allows people who face human rights abuse, persecution, discrimination in their home country to settle permanently in Australia. A person may be eligible for the special humanitarian program if an immediate family member of theirs who has already been resettled in Australia proposes him or her for a visa. SRS works directly with the immediate family member in completing the application process. To successfully apply for a visa under the program, applicants are required to read and accurately complete 2 documents spanning about 45 pages. SRS will assist applicants in working through these documents, which demand a significant amount of information. So without any support, the demands of the forms can be quite confronting for anyone, let alone someone who's desperate to reunite their family. We do not provide migration advice, but instead help in the step-by-step completion of the application forms. The whole process could take a few months, and therefore it would involve several meetings between the proposer and our volunteers. In certain cases, our volunteers will need to engage the assistance of an interpreter to efficiently communicate with the proposer. At present, SRS is pilot testing the system, which has been formed through our partnership with the Migrant Resource Centre. To date, we have 8 volunteers who have undergone the required statutory checks and have also received training so that each volunteer is fully equipped to assist every client. The bursary has really been instrumental in the progress of the SRS thus far, and we aspire to expand our program next year and bring on board more volunteers who are really eager to further this cause. On behalf of the SRS, I extend my deepest gratitude to everyone involved in making this bursary available and contributing to it in one way or another. The late Mr. Sandy Duncanson inspired us with his life, and we hope that through the work of the Student Refugee Support Society, the zeal for social justice will continue burning bright within UTES and our greater communities for many more years to come. Thank you.
So just touching that button there.
Well, thank God Rick just explained that to me because I was worried I was going to cause some problems with the slides. So my program is called the Young Leaders Program, and it is something that is very near and dear to my heart, and I will eternally be grateful to Sandy Duncanson, his family, and all the donors for making this dream of mine a reality. The Young Leaders Program is aimed at the youth, so anyone aged between the age of 13 and 18, And what it does is it aims to educate and empower the youth to get involved in social justice issues. So we've got several programs in place, and this is something that's going to be launched next year. First thing is we're going to get community leaders together, we're going to get NGOs together, and we're going to get anyone who's studying at the university to come together and brainstorm what are some of the key social justice issues that are impacting our society today. Doing that will help us educate the youth about how they can engage with it. The next step is we'll run a forum. So what the forum does is we'll get all the schools, so we've already started contacting a few schools and we've got a lot of interest in it. The schools will send their students to the program, and we will run workshops where we not only give them the information about all the issues that are on hand, but we'll also empower them with the skills that they need to engage with those issues. So things like campaigning skills, fundraising skills, event management skills, public speaking. And then the final step is then to mentor the youth to develop their own ideas and their own initiatives, and then funding them and guiding them to fulfilling those ideas. So I've been very lucky because I'm actually graduating at the end of this year, and I have had to pass the beacon on, and we've got an amazing list of people joining the committee, and some of them are present in the room today, and I'm thankful that they have volunteered their time to be part of a program. The last thing I would say is that if there's anyone in this room, if you're part of an NGO or legal service, or you're just a community member who's very interested in just helping the youth get involved in some shape or form and inspiring them, I would love to hear from you and get you involved in some way. So first thing first, Facebook is the big thing now. So if you add us on Facebook or come and speak to me after this event, we'd love to get you involved. So thank you once again to Sandy Duncanson and his family, and to Rick for helping with this as well.
Thank you, George and Sarat. You can see why it's such a pleasure. At the moment, I've got about 4 hours left as acting dean. Why it's such a pleasure being an acting dean and a law school that attracts students from around the world, and especially from Singapore, and the quality of those students and their commitment in that process. So thank you very much. It's my great pleasure now to introduce Jane Hutchison, another one of my former students, and a great pleasure to be able to introduce. You can read her background there, but she's an inspiring person, a person who's committed and passionate about her cause, starting off with a $50 in the bank organisation, now becoming probably the biggest landowner, or coming close to the biggest landowner in Tasmania, all inspired by a commitment to a particular cause, a great friend of Sandy and Sandy's family, and I think one of those great contributors to our society. So her job is to introduce David, and I think she'll do a very good job of that. She's had him down at Research Bay today with the Governor. He had to wear his suit, got a little bit of sand on it, but he was ready to go. So over to you, Jane.
Thank you, Rick. If only half that were true, but thank you. Well, I'm delighted to be invited to introduce David Morrison. It's a real privilege and a pleasure. As many of you know, David Morrison is a retired Australian military officer. David was born into a military family and enrolled in the Army after graduating from the ANU in 1979. He quickly progressed through the ranks and was appointed Chief of Army in 2011, and when you hear him speak, you'll understand why. As Chief of the Army for the Australian Defence Force, David took on a battle for cultural change within the organisation, and that saw an unprecedented move towards gender equality. From the time of his appointment, David had to deal with a series of crises that exposed an underlying culture of sexual degradation and abuse of women. Around the same time, Sex Discrimination Commissioner for the Australian Human Rights Commission, Elizabeth Broderick, had started an investigation into the culture and how to change it. Elizabeth and David have become really good friends through that process, as they both strongly believe that equality makes for stronger organisations, communities and nations. David is internationally recognised for his commitment to gender equality, diversity and inclusion. And with Elizabeth's support, he's championed a cultural shift in the Australian Defence Forces that will leave its mark forever. Since then, the number of women joining the Army has grown by 2%, and the culture is more accepting of racial, ethnic and sexual diversity. David retired in 2015 after 35 years in the Australian Army. I use the word retired very loosely. He continues his commitment as a champion of human rights in his new role as Chair of the Diversity Council of Australia. David has a dizzying suite of military awards for his time in service. He was appointed a member of the Order of Australia in 1999, as an officer of the Order of Australia in 2010, and is this year's Australian of the Year. And tonight he will be speaking on the topic of seeing the unseen and hearing the unheard. Today David told me an anecdote in the car as we were driving to Recherche Bay. And he said this. He said, in his very modest way, "I only kicked a stone down the road. It was the action of others that caused the avalanche." Well, I'm so grateful to you, David, for kicking that stone down the road, and I'm very grateful to all of you for being part of the avalanche. Please welcome David Morrison.
The bar has already been set fairly high for me and I don't need it any higher. Look, I would like to begin by also paying my acknowledgements to the First Peoples of this country. I will speak about the power of storytelling during my address this evening. And I think that we will pay true respect to the First Peoples of this country, our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters, when we fold 50,000 years of stories into the great contemporary Australian narrative in a way that we are yet to do. And when we do that, we will pay deep and meaningful respect to their elders, past, present and future. I also want to acknowledge a second group of people, and I do this every single time I speak. I've been doing it now for over 2 years, and I will continue to do it, I think, for the foreseeable future. I want to pay my respects to the victims and survivors of domestic violence in this country. I think it is one of our greatest social issues. And I think how we fashion a world that is safer for our sons, and especially our daughters, will become a hallmark of how future generations view our time here as citizens in Australia. While I will speak no more about domestic violence this evening, except that there is a question and answer period and I would be very happy to take any questions that you might want to ask, I would make this observation. The causes of gender violence are, domestic violence and family abuse rather, are complex. But surely they are founded in gender inequality, first and foremost. And I will certainly be speaking about inequality tonight and what we can do as today's Australians in leaving a legacy that has true social justice meaning to those that come after us. I would like to thank the Duncanson family for including me in an exceptional group of speakers who have given the Sandy Duncanson address here at the university over the course of the last 5 years. I've been privileged to meet your governor today, and I know Andrea as well, and I'm just feel a real honour in being asked to speak to you tonight. I'd like to thank you, Rick, for making that possible, to the faculty and to the student body of the University of Tasmania. Thank you very much. To the distinguished guests all who have come tonight, I do feel humbled to be with you, and I do want to take this opportunity of paying a deep gratitude to Jane Hutchinson, not just for those lovely words, but for what she has done as your Tasmanian Australian of the Year. She is an extraordinary Australian, an extraordinary Tasmanian, and a wonderful role model. So thank you, Jane. You have just... she set out the inventory for my 3 days in Tasmania like a military campaign. I was right at home. So I would like to start by making an observation about leadership. And then I want to talk about my time as your Chief of Army and how relatively late in my life, really from the age of about 55 on, I came to see issues that I hadn't seen in the same way before, and most particularly to hear voices that I hadn't heard as clearly as I should have before. My father was the single greatest role model, male role model in my life. He was also a wonderful public speaker, and he gave me invaluable advice. He said, stand up, tell them what you're going to say it, and then sit down. If only he had patented that piece of advice, I think the Morrison family would be very well off today, although I must say not enough speakers probably heed that very sage advice. So that's what I'm going to talk about. I have 30 minutes, and then there is time, should you wish to explore any of the themes that I have covered, for you to ask questions and for me to hopefully give answers. So first, an observation about leadership, because while we're talking about social justice here tonight, social justice, like all great social causes, only comes about if there is leadership. Not just leadership from those who fill appointed positions, be they governmental or academic or military, but all of us displaying leadership in the course of our professional and our personal lives. Early in my time as the Chief of Army, I was speaking to an audience about this size. It was a military audience. It was at one of our staff colleges, and I had finished my address and I was asked the entirely reasonable question by one of the audience, and it was, what's it like to be the Chief of Army? And you would think, would you not, that if there was anybody on the planet who should have a ready-made answer for that very reasonable question, it would have been me. But I didn't. The Army is a large, complex organisation with a deep history. And I didn't have a ready-made answer. But I went away and I thought about it. And for all the men in the audience, you would perhaps be able to identify with this. I had one of those happy, random thoughts while shaving. Well, maybe not you, Rick, but anyway, others in any case. And the next time I was asked that question, which wasn't very far into the future, I answered it in this way. And clearly I'm sharing this with you tonight because I do think it has broader application than just being seen within a military sphere. I said, as the Chief of Army, I think I live permanently in 3 time zones. I always live in the past because as your chief, I am the custodian of the history, the heritage, the ethos, the ethical foundations of a great national institution. And I know that there would be some in my audience tonight who wouldn't share my views about military service and who might dispute the fact that I describe the Army as a great national institution, but it is. Millions of our fellow Australians have served in its ranks for over a century. And when I speak, as I get the chance quite often now, to the captains of industry, I say, look, your brand is good, but my brand was better. And I get that reaction from the captains of industry, but I point out to them that the Army brand has within it names like Gallipoli and Villiers-Bretneux and Alamein and Tobruk and Kokoda and Capion and Long Tan, and is rooted in the 102,000 names that sit on the Roll of Honour of our War Memorial. It is a great national institution. And I felt deeply my sense of responsibility, living in the past as I always did, and I guess for the remainder of my life always will. And of course, like us all, I live every day in the present, trying to make one decision after another to get me from one sunrise to the next. But most of all, I told my audience, I think I live in the future. Because I've realised, as the chief of a national institution, that my legacy, for good or for ill, will be realised long after I have left, in the 3rd or maybe the 4th decade of this century. And it won't apply just to the training systems or the equipment that the Army will possess 20 years from now, it will certainly be the culture of the organisation. And I think framing a sense of leadership around the legacy that you will leave when you are a fading photo in a dusty hall helps to give a gravitas and a longevity to what you can leave as a legacy as a leader. That's how social justice and changes to social justice and improvements in social justice surely are affected in the busy and sometimes distracted communities within which we live. Coming into the job as your Chief of Army in June of 2011, I thought that the big challenges that I would stand next to, the legacies that I would leave, would most particularly be around those that I had been ideally prepared for. Not the ideal candidate, not the ideal Chief of Army, but at least ideally prepared. I'd had operational service, I'd managed big budgets, I'd dealt with force structure and capability development issues, I'd cared for soldiers, and I'd dealt with a number of personnel issues, and I thought that they would be the challenges. And it turned out to be different. It turned out that the big challenge that I stood next to was seeing this extraordinary national institution's culture in a way I had not seen it before. Now, before I say anything more, I do need to give a personal context to how I viewed our army. My father, Albie Morrison, born in 1927, joined our army in January of 1945. The Second World War was still being fought, and soon after, he served for 2 years as a lieutenant and as a captain in the war in Korea. Later in his distinguished military career, he commanded an infantry battalion in South Vietnam in 1969. His service and mine briefly overlapped. He left the army in 1982, and I joined in 1979. And so between Dad and I, there is an unbroken chain of 70 years of service to this nation. I have been surrounded by the Australian Army all of my life, not just professionally. And no one loves our army more than me. No one could. And yet, I now understand that aspects of the culture of our army were deeply flawed. And I am mindful of all of the privileges that I have had in my life, all of the role models, men and women. And yet, at the age of 55, I think I believed too much about our culture and didn't look hard enough at it. The fact that I do now has made me not just a better general or a better leader, but a better man. So, how did that happen? Well, before I describe that, I want to give you an understanding of how far I've moved. And I also want to tell you that I'm going to speak about culture in a moment, and I have not one single academic qualification to do so. I do feel the need to come clean on this one, standing as I am in the University of Tasmania. Not one. And yet, I will not only talk about culture, I'll define it, and then I'll prove it. You didn't waste your time coming out tonight. Everyone who's thinking about doing an anthropological degree is going to take years off their studies as a result of this evening. But I do want to give you an indication of how far I moved. Some months before I became your Chief of Army, there was an incident at our Defence University, the Australian Defence Force Academy, that has gone into the Australian lexicon under the unfortunate title of the ADFA Skype scandal. I won't go into the criminal and sordid details other than to quickly describe the fact that a group of young men who had been part of our army for less than 10 weeks, in their first year of their university course to eventually become leaders in our Defence Force, conspired amongst themselves so that one of their number convinced an unwitting female victim to engage in a consensual sex act with him, and unknown to her, that act was captured by a hidden camera and streamed via Skype to the men in another room. Now, the matter was eventually handled, but my perspective was that the actions of those young men, criminal and repugnant as they were, was much more reflective about them as individuals, or their upbringing, or their schooling, or their friends, than anything that it said about the great national institution that is the Australian Army. And I would think that there are some in my audience who would accept that view. Certainly it was a widely held view in our Defence Force. But I am now of a diametrically opposed view to that. I now believe that those young men were drawn to our culture. It, of course, was an erroneous and repugnant view of the culture of a great national institution. But in their minds, it somehow gave them some form of tacit condonement for what they did. Now, I have some very strong public critics for holding this view now. And I respect my critics' right to hold those views. But they are wrong, and I am right. Culture counts. It encapsulates us from our first breath. It creates a vista of opportunities for some, and from our first breath, it closes down the range of opportunities for others. It is the means by which we judge merit and who is in and who is out. And in the hands of some, particularly in an organisation like the Army, it can be used as an exceptionally powerful tool of exclusion, not inclusion. So let me define culture for you, and then, as I promised, prove it. Culture is the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. There you go. For the anthropologists in the room, I apologise. And yet, I haven't had anyone of an academic standing call me too seriously to task as I've described culture before. And now I said I'd prove it to you, and I will. So I'll say two words to you, and I'll tell you all what you thought. The two words, Aussie digger. You've thought of a male who's white, who's Anglo-Saxon, probably from a rural background, a natural soldier requiring almost no training, who fights best with a hangover, who never salutes officers, especially the POMs. But who's thought of a man or woman of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander heritage, a man or woman of Muslim faith, a man or woman of a different sexual orientation to the heterosexual orientation that I have? Probably very few, because encapsulated in those two words is a world of meaning. It's not an accurate description of our army, but it is how it is perceived. And several months ago, before the last election, I had the opportunity to speak to the senior leadership of one of the big four banks. And I used this rather amateurish social experiment, and I got a predictable reaction from them. And then I said, well, look, just for the sake of exercise, let's juxtapose the term Aussie digger for Aussie banker. The laughter died from that audience, I can tell you. Because it doesn't matter how the banking institution sees itself, it's how we, the non-banking sector of Australia, view it. And that's the reason why we are still debating at federal level whether there will be a Royal Commission into the culture of our banking sector here in Australia. Culture counts. And several months after I had been appointed as your chief, I was sitting in my office in Canberra, and a very fine office the Chief of Army has. I accept that most of you will never get a chance to step inside it. I can tell you it has a wonderful view of a lake. And on one particular morning, a meeting had been arranged with Elizabeth Broderick, who was the Sex Discrimination Commissioner of Australia, who had been appointed by the then Labor government to conduct a review into the treatment of women inside the ADF as a result of what had occurred at ADFA. And she appeared in my diary, and I thought, okay, that's fair enough. She will be undoubtedly better informed from talking to me. Yes, I know this is being recorded and she might see this one day, but that's a risk I'm prepared to take. I thought she should be able to take notes because clearly I was going to be the subject matter expert here. I had been training young men and women who had joined our army for the best part of 3 decades. I understood how we inculcated values within them. I thought she'd want to talk about ADFA. and the Royal Military College Duntroon and our various training schools. I thought she'd admire my view, and she did none of those things. I don't know if anyone in the audience knows Liz, but I can attest to the fact that she is a force of nature. And she walked into my office and without preamble, without admiring the view, sat down across from me and asked me a question for which I had no answer. Now, I am not going to tell the women in the audience anything you don't already know, but there is nothing more uncomfortable for a middle-aged Anglo-Saxon male who is sitting at the top of their profession to be asked a question, particularly by a woman, from outside of the profession for which they have no answer. And her question, without preamble, was, General, can you tell me why less than 10% of your workforce has been women for the last 100 years? And I thought, that's got nothing to do with ADFA. So I looked at the view while I tried to get my thoughts together. I tried to present, that sort of general a silhouette against, a clear blue sky, and hope that she would be impressed by that, but she wasn't. So I looked back at her and I did what fully paid up card-carrying members of my tribe did, or do. I made it up. And it was the single dumbest mistake I made, I think, in my entire time in the army. Because when she said, why have less than 10% of your workforce been women for the last 100 years, I looked at her and said, well, Liz, that's just the way it is. Oh, and the collective intake of breath from all of the women in the audience, which almost took the oxygen out of the auditorium, does absolutely show my folly. But there's another aspect to this, and that's the reason why I tell this story. In answering it, I, with the wisdom of hindsight, see now that I did believe it. And in believing it, I was a captive of our culture. Not a custodian, a captive. Someone who had been brought through a military system, in my case, absolutely believing the tenets and the values of the culture and not seeing the issues within. And yet what Liz was pointing to, unerringly and unambiguously, was that something must be wrong with your culture if for 100 years you've made such abject use of the talent in 51% of Australia's population. It's women. Now, I would think that, on reflection, I got with the program pretty quickly. And I started to lead with the head. And if you want to make changes, beneficial changes to social justice or to any great cause, you have to be rational. You have to look at the logic. You have to analyse the data. You have to set targets. You have to look at the policies that underpin the operations of your organisation. And we did all that. We took back to first principles how we judge merit, very successfully. We shook up the system by which we selected leaders now and into the future, very successfully. We grew the number of women in our army, by over 700 in 2.5 years. And I doubt that there is an organisation anywhere in the world that could make a similar claim. I'm deeply proud of what happened as a result of a range of initiatives that we took. And I think that as a leader, starting to lead with the head on this matter was an absolute requirement. But it was only 50% of the solution. And the other 50% was also provided by Liz Broderick. It was a second meeting, held several months after our first, and it not just changed the way I led our army, it changed me as a leader and as a man. Liz had been approached by a number of women in the ADF who had come forward to her to tell their story as part of her review into the treatment of women in the ADF. 3 women of extraordinary integrity and courage said that they would have a personal conversation with the head of their organisation. And Liz rang me and asked me to come to Sydney to meet with them. Now, in what I have publicly described on a number of occasions now as the most distressing day of my military career, and without any exaggeration, many distressing days. 3 women of courage and great integrity told me how they had joined our army for much purer reasons than I had ever joined, wanting to put service before self, wanting to make a difference in our country's name, wanting to realise their potential and their talent in this organisation, and how we had responded by preying on them, by stripping them of their self-respect and their dignity, by treating them as second-class citizens. At one moment, which I will carry with me to the day, in fact, perhaps the moment of my death, one of these women was telling me her story, and it was a deeply emotional exchange on both sides. And she was accompanied by her mother. And there were only 4 people in a small room in the Human Rights Commission in Sydney. Me, Liz Broderick, the woman officer, and her mother. And her mother leant into my field of vision and said, "I gave you my daughter, and this is what you have done to her." And I am very proud in sharing with you that I heard the use of the personal pronoun you, not as collective or plural, but as singular and personal. What I heard her mother say was, "I gave you, David Morrison, my daughter, and this is what you, David Morrison, have done to her." And I agreed. I agreed then, I agree now, I will agree to the day I die. I'd not met her, I'd never served with her, but I was the custodian of our army. I had served in its ranks for 30 plus years. I was absolutely responsible for what had happened to her. And as I came back to Canberra, I was empowered to do something about our culture, leading now, I think, from the heart as well as the head. Again, I have my critics for being passionate about these issues. They say I don't do nuance well, that I'm unambiguous, and they're right. And I'm proud of it. Because we as a society need to make fundamental changes if we are to deliver a better world for our sons, but especially our daughters. We need to recognise that the prevailing stories in our society, even in 2016, are overwhelmingly skewed to the male and to the male of an Anglo-Saxon heritage. We celebrate the stories of millions of successful women, and of course there are millions of successful women in today's Australia, and millions upon millions over the last 50,000 years of human habitation. But we celebrate them in a different way. We fold them into the great Australian narrative, while men's stories are often cast in bronze, put on a plinth in a public park and occasionally saluted. Think about the iconic stereotypes here in Australia. The bronzed Anzac, the dashing sportsman, the stoic pioneer. These are men's stories. And when we tell them with such verve and such vigour, we need to be very, very particular that they too don't become tools of exclusion for too many of our fellow citizens. The army went through many difficult periods, coming to terms with its culture. There were those, of course, who resisted. And I was comforted on occasions by going back to 16th century Italy to a particular individual who doesn't serve readily as a role model for any organisation these days. His name is Niccolo Machiavelli. But if you want to understand human nature and you don't have too much time on your hands, read Machiavelli. He observed that there's no more delicate a matter to take in hand, nor more doubtful in its success, than to set up as a leader of change, for he who innovates will have for his enemy all those who are well off under the existing order of things. And then we need to ask ourselves, who forms the status quo? Who decides who's in and who's out, who has merit and who doesn't? I do think we need to disrupt this today, in the future. We need to continually take pride in the fact that we live within the great community of Australia, the best country on earth. But we need to recognise that a hallmark of our greatness is that we know we can be better. And that's what I think the institution that has grown up around the Australian of the Year, recognising women like Jane or Liz Broderick and many others in every state and territory for the last 40 years in this country, is an affirmation that we should take pride in men and women who stand up and point to inequities within our justice system or within the way we live as a society, who recognise that they can only make an individual contribution, but in making that individual contribution, they make a contribution for all of us. When I was a young officer, I was struggling to find the framework within which I was serving in our army. I had not joined for the pure reasons of those three women that I spoke to many years later. I had been a very indifferent arts graduate at the Australian National University in the 1970s, when I've got to tell the younger members of my audience, university education was free, and unfortunately I treated it as such. I'd finished my university degree, I was broke, and I didn't want to be a public servant in Canberra, and I thought I'd join the army for a couple of years, get a little bit of money, and go and do something else with my life. Well, that's pretty much the way it's turned out. It just took me 36 and a half. But towards the end of my third year, I was struggling. And I was posted to our School of Infantry in the Hunter Valley in New South Wales, and I can't even remember the incident now, but I got something wrong. And I let the side down. And I cared, but I didn't care. I thought, I'm going to leave. I'm going to go and do something else with my life. And at the end of a long day where I had been the target of a number of eyes of displeasure, my platoon sergeant, who was junior to me in rank but so much senior to me in life and military experience, said, I want a word with you. And to be honest, I didn't want a word with him. I wanted to just go back to the officers' mess and have a beer and try and forget about the day. And he ushered me into a small platoon office, and he closed the door with some intent, and I was a bit surprised by that. And then he looked at me and he pointed at me directly, and I was very surprised at that, because that's not how a hierarchical organisation like an army functions. And he said to me, you need to realise that you are the legacy of everyone who has served before you. Millions of Australian men and women. You are the legacy of your parents and your teachers and your friends, and what you are failing to do is asking yourself, what is the legacy you are going to leave? It shook me to my core. I hardly became the poster boy for what you would want in a military officer as a result, but it did set me on a different path. We all have the opportunities to leave legacy. And sometimes that legacy will be realised long after we've not just finished our appointment, but perhaps finished our lives. It is the very special gift that actually sits with us as members of the human race. Legacy. To make a difference. To create a more socially equal world, where men and women, irrespective of the God they believe in, their gender, their sexual orientation, whether they're judged able-bodied or disabled, have the chance to reach their potential, because when they reach their potential, we as a society get our chance to reach our potential. We make it when we create world-class movements for conservation, recognising that we have done far too much harm to this planet, and we need to fashion a different environment for those who live after us. And whether we hold the rank of Lieutenant General or Dean or Vice-Chancellor or Chief Justice, whether our lives are short or long, rich or poor, we all have that chance. So I'd like to thank again the Duncanson family for giving me the chance to speak about social justice tonight, in memory of Sandy, who made his own contributions in a life that was far too short. And close on the idea that legacy isn't just within our grasp, it's our gift. So thank you very much for including me this evening, and I'm really happy to take any questions that anyone might like to ask. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Somebody listening to your lecture might be under the misapprehension that one day you made a big step that took you to a socially enlightened person, when in fact it's a series, if not thousands of steps that lead you to a better person to get there. What would you say to somebody who hasn't taken that first step and feels that they're not able to change who they are?
Well, if Niccolo Machiavelli is a difficult role model, Mao Zedong is an even more difficult one, but I think he observed that even the longest journey starts with the first step. And we all have moments in our lives, and you're absolutely right. In a 35-minute speech, you can't cover all of the blind alleys and cul-de-sacs that I walked down, and I took a number of people with me as we started a journey, not just of personal realisation, but organisational renewal. But unless you make that first step, what are you doing? Sitting in a pristine office looking at a lovely view of a lake. I'm a great reader now, in far too late a life, of philosophy and philosophers. Socrates observed that the unexamined life is not worth leading, and I couldn't agree more with him. But I also agree with the American jurist Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., a veteran of the American Civil War and someone who shaped the modern legislature of the United States, who observed that if life is action and passion, then it behoves a man, and he used that term as a man of his time, it behoves a man to embrace the passion and actions of his time, lest he be judged to have never lived at all. And who would want that as their fading thought as they shuffle off this mortal coil? Not you, not me, not us. So I'll leave. I don't mind. I don't want to put you under any pressure, but we'll try and work either side of the room to keep you active. Sorry.
Mr. Morrison, I wanted to
Please call me David.
David, I wanted to challenge you on your definition of culture.
Oh, good. You're the first.
Because it seems to me that the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves are often so much hogwash, marketing, myth-making. Isn't a better definition of culture, to paraphrase some of your famous words, that set of behaviours that we as an institution or as a nation are prepared to tolerate or walk past? Isn't that a better definition of culture?
Maybe, but my point here is that culture is pervasive, that it shapes our world and our lives. It isn't necessarily the accurate reflection of our society that we live in. Indeed, it can be quite often used as a means by which the status quo continue their control over the social mores to which we are supposedly required to live. When you look at human history, and I am a student of history, I think you see great movements forward in terms of social justice, for example, when matters that pertain to both the status quo and the prevailing culture are challenged. And that's what happened to me. I think for a long time I had accepted the fact that there were, of course, people I was serving with who were, you could fit them under the description bad apples. But all of those reviews that had been conducted, and the hundreds of recommendations that had come out of 13 reviews in 15 years into culture, which we hadn't read as a complete work and seen as episodes in a 15-year period. When you look at them as signposts along a path that leads you to an inescapable conclusion that there are systemic flaws in your culture, that's where you have the moment of revelation. And I am not saying for one single moment that the Army and its culture is deficient and in some ways letting the nation down. But there were some within our ranks who were using elements of our culture to exclude, not include. And that had to be dealt with if we were to realise not just the organisation's talent, but the talent of those that make up the organisation. So I do take your point, but I use my definition of culture to make the points that I want to make. Thank you.
I guess one of the challenges that you would have faced is you had that meeting with Elizabeth, and she, I guess, put a challenge to you and you found yourself wanting. One of the great challenges with cultural change is ensuring that it's not just you that has that realisation, and it's the really hard work of change. And I'm just interested to hear from you about what some of that looked like and how you think it's going to continue under subsequent leadership.
So what it looked like in its most palpable form was when I would visit Army units and have young soldiers talk to me in their words, but convey the themes that I had been talking to them about. And indeed, I would make this observation that from my own particular experience, the leadership group of the Army, which is extensive, bought in really quickly. They were educated men and women, many with very significant tertiary qualifications. And a point of our Army, and in fact I'm delighted to share it in this audience, we have 6 regular brigades in the Australian Army, and currently 3 of those brigade commanders are PhD, and the other 3 hold at least 1 master's qualification. We have a very educated leadership group within our Army who are open to logic and analysis and reason. And my experience was that younger soldiers and officers didn't see the same issues as I saw. They looked at it and went, why are you making this point? Of course we understand that. This is our life's experience. But there is a middle group, and I thought it may have been particular to the Army, but now I understand that it's actually in every single organisation, not just here in Australia, but around the world. And I would describe them as Machiavelli's middle. They are not people who will ever be the senior leadership, probably because they don't have the vision and the attributes. But they absolutely believe that they are the glue that holds the organisation together. And I respect that too. It's just that I think that they value the past and don't think about the future. And then you have got to find ways and means of convincing them to make a difference in their own right, or to engineer ways that they don't remain within the organisation. Now, I also think that it would be impossible now for a service chief in this country to be appointed who doesn't deeply believe exactly what I believe, that culture, issues that create better diversity and inclusivity lead to diversity of thinking, lead to creative thought, lead us to the ability to outthink a competitor or an adversary, and that's just what you want in our military. And I think that's a very good thing, and I think it is a testament to the extraordinary work done by thousands of soldiers, sailors, airmen and women who over the last 5 years have become world class in making an organisation more progressive, more diverse and more inclusive.
David, thank you. I suspect my question is a slight extension of the one that you've just answered so generously. If I pick up on your model of Machiavelli as a stimulus for thinking, then I think one of the things that he was trying to arguing was that in the Renaissance that we should move out from revelation to awakening. Mm-hmm. And that awakening is about generating the capacity within institutional structures, be it society or the army or a university, for us to be truly learning organisations. Yep. So if you were to reflect now on what it would take for you to have been part of a learning organisation rather than an organisation that stumbled as a result of revelation, then what would be the 3 key characteristics of a good learning organisation, so that we as a society need not go through the process of revelation, that it is that we are constantly in the awakening mode? That was the argument of the Renaissance and all that followed, as opposed to that we've persisted in this, it must be revealed to us in order that we can participate, which is a very crude summary of what I think you're articulating. So what does a good learning organisation look like, so that we don't have to stumble and step?
Yeah. First, it needs to realise that there will be elements within its culture, the stories you tells itself about itself, that could do with review. Be seen with contemporary eyes if you want, and to be seen as to whether they are going to give you relevance in your marketplace. Whether you're a university or an army, the marketplace for both of us is the families of Australia. So is the university's culture relevant to the families of Australia? Is our military relevant to the families of Australia? I would hold a view that in our Army's case, we were losing market share. We were losing it to organisations that were demonstrating a palpable and tangible commitment to social values. And when we started to make a difference in our culture, we started to see changes immediately. The second attribute that you've asked for is, I think that organisations need to realise that diversity is a box-ticking exercise if it isn't accompanied by inclusivity, where men and women, irrespective of their heritage or their gender or their sexual orientation or their religious beliefs, have the confidence to contribute. It might mean that they aren't agreed with, but they feel valued because they are listened to. And that creates, as I said earlier, diversity of thinking. And the third attribute, well, you better realise that you're going to make mistakes. Because, at least as far as I'm aware, there has never been a perfect person or organisation in the history of the planet. And if you're going to make mistakes, then you better learn from them. One of the really big lessons for me was never waste a crisis. And we had a crisis in 2013 with another coming to light of some really terrible behaviour by a group of more senior individuals than had occurred at ADFA in 2011. And we dealt with it exceptionally publicly. That was with the support of the then Minister for Defence, Stephen Smith, and my boss, David Hurley, who was the Chief of the Defence Force, and I gave a number of very public interviews about the extent of the issue and what we were doing, and I guaranteed you, a fellow citizen of Australia, that I would come back and tell you about our progress, and I did repeatedly. That's what organisations really do if they want to be learning organisations.
Do you ever find that your legitimacy is challenged, or people try and discount your views in your role as an ambassador for equality, either through the context of your military experience or as a white male? And if so, what do you say to them in those conversations?
I certainly do, and I'm challenged by a variety of people, some who don't like what they're hearing, some who I think are part of the status quo, who don't like people like me talking about why we need to be more inclusive and how we will be a better society when we are. And there are other groups of people, and while I respect their views, I do see them as entrenched and maintaining or clinging to a status quo that I think speaks to a very distorted view of what they see as the halcyon days in Australia that actually never existed. And I've got different critics who see me as a white, middle-aged, privileged male talking about matters around particularly gender and wondering why I feel the need to do this. And I have deep respect for those critics. But I say to them that this is not about fixing women. It's about fixing us. It's a societal issue. And men like me, who now see the world differently and hear voices differently, should at least be able to share my experience if it is for the public good. And while it is for the public good, I will continue to do it. So I'm going to. And I think we must be close on time, so a few minutes. I would hate to keep you here any longer than...
Thanks, David. There are many people in Australian society who feel that you've fallen down the left-wing rabbit hole.
Oh, yeah? Yeah.
Do you feel that you've brought conservatives along on your journey?
The army was, I would think, a bastion of conservatism. So yes, I do think I've brought at least part of our society along. I think that there are a group of very senior men across corporate Australia, across the public service, across government, across the not-for-profit sector, who now would probably characterise their stories as different but somewhat similar to mine, who see the world differently. And I'm now talking about the true captains of industry in Australia, who make up groups like the Male Champions of Change, of which I am a member, who are speaking about these matters not just with true belief but with resolve to try and make a difference. I think that we are at a tipping point in Australia at the moment. I think that there are great opportunities to reach a level where people have the opportunity to contribute in a way that they haven't in the past. But if we take our eye off this, if we take our foot off the pedal, then we will slip back into glide mode where the status quo have got their hand fully on the rudder. I am not preaching social revolution. I'm preaching equal opportunity. And I think that without exaggerating my importance, because I certainly don't, human history has shown countless occasions where men such as yourself or men such as me or women have the opportunity to make a difference and leave a legacy, and they have, and society has moved on and become better as a consequence of what they have done during the course of their lives. So whether I have critics who say that I've disappeared down left-wing burrows or not, I don't think I have. I think that I've been given an opportunity to continue to make a contribution in my post-military life, and I would be arrogant if I step back from taking every opportunity that has been given me to do just that. And my critics can go hang. Figuratively, not literally. Yes.
Thank you. Thanks for coming to see us, David. My question is, Australia is geographically as well as culturally an island, and I was wondering how you see us on the world stage and how we can contribute and how globally we are affected by the different changes in other cultures.
So you need to come to Launceston tomorrow evening, where I'm speaking to a subject, are we girt by sea or girt by beach? But because you're probably busy and won't be in Launceston, I will quickly cover. I think Australia, for the period of European settlement in this country, has struggled with its identity. We live on the world's largest island, surrounded by a number of the world's great oceans. And yet I don't think either in a military sense or in a societal sense we have adopted what I would call a maritime philosophy. Indeed, I think we have a continental mindset, looking in rather than looking out. And that we as a nation, democratic, middle-powered, fundamentally immersed in the global trading scheme, are so much the better when we are girt by sea, our entry point to the world, rather than girt by beach, trying to inure ourselves from what we see as the threats of our world. I think for a long period of time during the 20th century, we sought security from Asia, not within Asia. I'm 60 years old, and for 10 years of my life I lived in a country that didn't give citizenship to its first people, where as a bipartisan government policy we declared Australia white. We've come so far from there because we have seen our place truly in the world, which is one that a former Prime Minister, Paul Keating, said was our great challenge, which he characterised in one word: engagement. And I am fearful at the moment that we are at least sometimes heeding the siren calls that would have us look in rather than look out. We are so much the better when our horizon is formed by the sea and the sky rather than sitting safe behind our pristine beaches. Thank you, Rick. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Okay, before I move the formal vote of thanks, just a couple of quick things. One is just a reminder about what the Sandy Duncanson bursary and lectures are about, and I think we've had a good example of that. But the other thing is to effectively create those bursaries so that people like George and Saris and others here in the audience and others to come can actually do those social justice projects, to be inspired and go on from there. So for those who've already given, can you please give again? Can you do it as a recurring gift? It's a fantastic effort. If you've never given to the Sandy Duncanson Fund, now's the chance to do it after this lecture, to pay for what's been a fantastic speech. Just on behalf of the committee, on behalf of the family, and on behalf of myself, David, I've been inspired. I'm at that point that you talk about in terms of leadership, within an institution, within a culture, which I find at times despairing because of the changes taking place. You've asked me to rethink about myself as an individual. You've asked me to rethink about myself as a leader, and about living in the past, the present and the future. And I think you've done that for everyone here. I set the bar high for you. I think you've cleared it well and truly. I think pity the next speaker, because they have seriously, they have really got a major challenge to take on. I think we'll find someone who can do it, and they'll be inspired by you. They'll watch your lectures and continue from there. But just what a fantastic legacy. And I'm talking here about Sandy. You know, as an individual, as a person I knew as a student, as my gardener, in between his bouts of cancer, etc., to be able to talk to him, he would be just so thrilled to see what's become, not only with his daughters, with his family, and with this selection, these bursaries, and students like Saris and George, but just the fact that you have now inspired many here, I hope, to think about their legacy. You know, at one stage I was thinking, I'm close to retirement, and you know, almost done what I'm going to do. I think I've re-questioned that, saying, can I leave a better legacy and more of a legacy than what I was going to leave? So thank you very much, David. It was a very impressive speech. Thank you. Okay, so thank you, everyone. Good night.